Good morning, everyone. We are going to start in a minute or two. We're just waiting for participants to join us. Thank you very much if you've made the time to be with us today. And we look forward to talking about our work and the work that's been going on around the African peer review mechanism across the continent. So let's just wait a minute or so, and then we can kick off. Okay, I think we're going to start. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. It's just after 12. I'm Stephen Grusd, and I am the head of our African Governance and Diplomacy program here at the South African Institute of International Affairs, SAIIA. We're delighted to have you, especially at this late time of the year, and to give us an opportunity to talk about the work that we've been doing and developments in the African peer review mechanism. I'm going to start with just a very brief summary of what the Aprm is and tries to do, and then we'll turn over to I'll go through the program and we'll turn over to our panelists. But in a nutshell, the African peer review mechanism was established in 2003 as Africa's governance promotion and self-monitoring mechanism. It asks countries to volunteer, and at the moment there are 41 out of the 55 members of the African Union that are members, and it requires a country to self-examine and then be examined by a panel of experts, and finally the head of state defends his or her report to the Aprm forum, which is the highest decision-making body. And it meets twice a year. Well, it meets at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. The issues that the review covers are very broad. There are four main thematic areas: democracy and political governance, economic governance and management, corporate governance, and socio-economic development. And within those themes is everything from trade, investment, human rights, elections, parliament, the presidency, vulnerable groups, development, and so on. And so it's a very wide-ranging process. SAIIA has been involved really right from the beginning, working on the Aprm with our partners across the continent. We're going to hear from some of them today. So about 25 reports have already been published by the Aprm, and it's been a busy year. There've been the peer review of Liberia happened at the beginning of the year, and the Aprm is actually currently in field in South Africa conducting the country review mission. We've also had review missions in Nigeria and Namibia, so it's probably expected that those three reports will be discussed at the next Aprm forum, which is scheduled for February 2022. There are a number of other events and initiatives that have been taken by the Aprm. I might go through a couple of them a little bit later. But I just want to check if Clementine from the Aprm Secretariat has joined us. Dalmar gave his apologies, he wasn't able to, and he delegated Clementine, but I haven't been able to get hold of her. So she may either join us a little bit later, or we'll move on without her if she's not with us. I don't see her on my screen. So I think we'll just move on. So there was meant to be some short remarks from the Aprm Secretariat. But what we're going to do now is I'm going to turn over to two of our panelists, and also we've had apologies from our colleagues in Zimbabwe. All of the people who worked actually on the Aprm work contracted COVID, so they're not able to join us. but I'll talk a little bit about the Zimbabwe process after we've heard from Maipelo and Tessa. Just a little bit of background. SAIIA has, for a long time, worked with civil society groups across the continent right from the beginning. In the early years, we went to early countries like Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa, Mauritius, and did workshops sensitizing people, civil society organizations about the APRM and how they could get involved. And we found over the years that just doing a one-off workshop where you parachute in and then you leave the country really wasn't enough to build capacity. And so we worked on a new model which was pioneered in Namibia, where we in 2018, where we worked with a coalition of civil society organizations through a one-year process to put together a report that would feed into their national APRM process. So working with civil society, helping them choose about roughly a dozen issues that they wanted to put forward as the key governance issues. We didn't dictate the content, we let the group decide that. And eventually a report was produced in Namibia, and the program was really successful. And so with the help of the Swedish government, who is one of our main funders on this project and one of the main funders of the South African Institute of International Affairs, we said, okay, let's try and expand this model and run it in various other countries. And so in 2020 and 2021, we worked with stakeholders in Botswana, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and then in the second half of the year, we've been working with Lesotho. We're hoping that Malawi will probably be the next country that we'll work in, to help civil society put together a written submission, no matter where in the process their country is, in order to really influence the process and have something written down that's well evidenced, that's well resourced, and allow them to thus participate in their national process and get those issues into the national report. So we're really delighted to be joined today by two of the people that we worked with in those countries. Firstly, we'll hear from Maipelo Pale, who is a program coordinator at the Botswana Council of Non-Governmental Organizations, and she has a master's in politics and international relations from the University of Botswana. Maipelo, if you could just put on your camera, and over to you.
Hi, Steve. Am I clear? Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Steve, for this opportunity to have invited Bokongo to be among the panelists. And I can see one of the board members, Relitsa Dizia, also to just support our efforts to be online. Thank you very much, Relitsa, for joining. As a summary, I'll just be sharing with you how the process unfolded in Botswana and what are the key things that as countries you can be able to just learn from our process and how it unfolded. So as a start, Botswana acceded to the APRM mechanism in February 2019, making it the 38th member state to take this step, which was a voluntary process, of course. And CSOs in Botswana initially convened the meeting sometime in March 2020, just to lay a foundation for participation in the APRM process. The Botswana Council of Non-Governmental Organizations, that is Bokongo, and the South African Institute of International Affairs, SAIIA, were at the helm of engagement, and then they decided that, okay, this is an opportunity now to take a further step to collaborate and partner so that the APRM process can be unfolded in Botswana, held by civil society organizations. So the two organizations facilitated the input by local civil society organizations in unpacking the 12 carefully selected key issues, because when we did the putting together of the 12 key issues, they came up to 12 in number. And then through the Aprm sensitization, the report was written, and then it was put together by almost over 35 civil society organizations around Botswana. That is where, again, we also used our regional offices that are not centralized in Gaborone, but are in other parts of the country, where inclusion was looked into, so that any other organization is not represented. It also went to not only engaging the NGOs, it also extended this invite to trade unions, to academia, to even to the media fraternity. So it was a vast of organizations that came together to put together all these 12 pertinent issues. So the Botswana Aprm popular sensitization had 6 key activities. That was the pre-planning meeting that was held in March 2020, the sensitization workshop, the online working group submission development, where small teams worked on 12 important governance issues, then the validation workshop, and then the launch of the Aprm, which happened sometime this year in April 2021. So these activities were originally planned to be were planned to be physical, that is face-to-face engagement, but due to the challenges of COVID, we had to adjust in the way of our delivery, and then they were tailored online. So all these other activities, except the 2 initial meetings that we had in March, those were the 2 that is the one that we had physically, and then all the rest of our activities were held virtually using the online delivery mode of Zoom and all that. And also that is where also SAIIA were able to support us with giving the participants data so that they can be able to connect. And these 12 issues that were carefully selected by Botswana, if I may just go through them quickly, is the governance, where citizen participation and economic inclusion, human rights, education, vulnerable groups, food security, public service and decentralization, separation of powers, transparency and accountability, crime and insecurity, foreign policy, research development and sustainable development, rural resource, and access to land and infrastructure. So these were the 12 pertinent issues that civil society as a whole they put together, and then they made our civil society submission in form of a booklet. So the lessons that during the process that I can share, which were very key, is that as much as maybe they do resonate with some of the countries, because we were tapping into the lessons that they went through. So all the mistakes that they made, we made sure that those mistakes, we are going to do everything that we can so that we don't find ourselves challenged by the things that challenge them. So so one of the key lesson that we learned was that the engagement has to involve as vast as it could all civil society around, because like I was saying, we did have different stakeholders that made this combination of civil society that were coming from the academia, from the media, NGOs, even from trade union. So make it as vast as you can to open it up to other civil society arenas, so that the involvement, the non-living one behind, the participatory aspect is taken into consideration. And then the other one that really helped our process was that as Bokongo, we are the coordinating body, so it's very critical, or it's very pivotal that you do have some sort of a coordinating body that will be coordinating or facilitating all these other civil society organizations, so that they stick to the timelines, they stick to the submissions, and also like you keep the the momentum up by always reminding them what they are supposed to be submitting. So it's also very critical to have a centralized body that will be coordinating and facilitating all these other ones that the core business will be submitted at. And then the other area is to focus on priority governance issues. I mean, there are a lot of issues around, but you have to know which priorities, key issues are there that you would want your government maybe to look into, that you think that they are very pertinent, that you think that these are the key issues that they are not supposed to be left out. Issues of human rights, issues of education, issues of the land, issues of water. Those are like pertinent issues that, in each and every report, they're expected to always be there. So it's very critical to like weigh which ones are your real priority areas that you would want to put forth as pertinent. And then the other one is that you have to build trust by involving government, as much as it will be civil society engagement, but it's also important that you involve government officials. Like here in Botswana, what we did, we were liaising with government officials, even inviting them to come and appreciate how the process is unfolding. They would come and become even speakers at the events that we are holding, so that they know how the process unfolds. Because fortunately in Botswana, civil society has been at the forefront with the implementation of the Aprm report, and government hasn't yet implemented from that part. So I think they have learned a lot from our engagement with them, and the time when now they will be doing that process, they'll be appreciative enough of us having extended the invite to them. So you have to involve government, and of course not letting them take the platform and maybe taking you astray from your core mandate of what you want to do. But it's very important that they're involved in the process, because anyway, these issues, when they're put together, you are going to take them to them so that they can see how they can be addressed. So create that conducive environment so that there's that rapport of a good relation, even if maybe you are a bit critical in some of the aspects, but take them along through that journey. And then also you have to be very familiar with the Aprm process. It's a very technical process, very it needs a lot of work to like read, and always catching up with timelines and all that. So know the process well, so that because when you know something better, you do it well. And also so that you are at the same page before you start with other stakeholders or other members, so that they understand what does the Aprm stands for and why they are doing the process, what are the benefits, so that they also appreciate, and also they are motivated in a way that whatever that we are doing is for the better good of a nation altogether. So it's very important to understand the Aprm process in that aspect. And then it is also the other key thing that I can say is that benchmark best practices. Like in our scenario, we benchmarked from Namibia, we benchmarked from Zambia, and then we benchmarked from I think South Africa, because these are the countries that did the Aprm before us. So all the lessons that they shared with us, we really took them very seriously, and then we did by all means to implement them when we did our process. So it was easier to not make the same mistakes that they did, because we really benchmarked the best practices that they shared with us. So benchmarking is one of the key areas that if you want your process to be successful, you have to tap into countries that have gone before you, so that you can get lessons learned, best lessons learned from them. And then the other thing is that do not politicize the process. I mean, everything's politics, of course, but try to not politicize the process itself, because once it's tainted with politics, the outcome of it is not going to be very nice, because some are going to be critical of it, thinking that you are aligned with a particular party. So take a non-partisan approach, like us in Bokongo, the organization, in all its mandates, it takes a non-partisan approach. So that is why each and every person were able to come and work with us, because they knew that we do not condone issues of politics in the process. So separating politics and the process, it's something that it's worth noting that you should do when implementing the Aprm process. And then, of course, warming up to the ICT. Like I said, initially we were to meet face-to-face, but with the advent of COVID, we had to change our delivery. We went online. So Zoom, Facebook, they came very critical in our implementation, because that is the mode that we went on using. So ICT, it's a very a good tool to use, and because if it wasn't for it, then we wouldn't have had collated haven't put together our submission, because we could have said, no, we are still waiting for COVID because of the restrictions and all that, and we wouldn't have done a lot. So ICT is one of the things that need to be incorporated into our operations of the day-to-day, so that we make sure that nothing that we are supposed to do, it's not left behind. So those were the lessons learned from Botswana unrolling. And of course, the only thing I think that I can note that was a real challenge was only the advent of COVID. But it's pleasing to say that Botswana published a well-researched and professional report on the state governance in Botswana, further highlighting pertinent issues that needed attention from government. And then these issues, like I said, they came to 12. So thank you very much to SAIIA for the support to have taken us through that process. So right now, we do have a report that we have shared with government, and slowly but surely they are tapping into it and looking at how to address, and it's even going to be maybe even our yardstick or our premises, even to tap into with it, even maybe when we look into the constitutional review that we are to also review in Botswana. So those issues, they will come very handy, because they are well-researched issues. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Maipelo. It was a pleasure working with Bokongo. It really was a very participatory process, and we really involved a lot of stakeholders, and that was really great. As you said, we had to adjust to the online environment, and we managed to do that. I've also posted 2 links in the chat. One is from a paper that was co-written by Maipelo that really covers her experience and the experience of Bokongo in working on the APRM. And then I've also put up a link to the actual submission, which is online. And there's also a short video. I see we're joined by quite a few people from Botswana, which is really great. And yeah, I think Botswana is going to be a shining light. And when it does come time for the government to start moving on APRM, they're going to have to contend with a very well-researched submission that's already in the public domain. And as she said, yesterday we were actually participating with our partners Bokongo in a workshop looking at the very important review of the constitution that is being undertaken in Botswana. And as she said, it's hoped that this submission can really be a foundational document for some of the issues that need to be unpacked and amended in the constitution. Botswana largely still operates on its independence constitution. So many people, including some political parties, feel that it's the right time now to update and modernize the constitution. Thank you very much, Maipelo. Our next panelist on this panel is Ms. Tessa Dooms, who is the director of Jotato Consulting, a development consultancy that provides organizations with services on policy, programming, and organizational strategies toward the development of Africa. Tessa used to also work at Youth Lab. And we worked very closely with Tessa on the South African submission that we helped to put together. And that was almost exclusively put together by young people. So Tessa, over to you to explore and explain what we did and what lessons you think others might be able to take from this important participatory process. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm really glad that we got involved with this work as Jotato Consulting. And I'm happy to share this experience that we had, particularly because it was with young people. And we saw some of the lessons that I want to share are more about what we learned about working with young people in policy environments than the report itself, because you can read the report. But I think the lessons were important. So the first thing to know about our process is that it was also one that was entirely virtual. So from the point that we started the process off, we were already deep into COVID. And so even recruiting people to be part of the process needed to be entirely virtual. What we ended up with, I think, was probably the better scenario than if we had done it in person. And I say that for two reasons. One is that we didn't end up with many organizations. And as we know, young people in our countries and across the continent are often not involved in formal civil society organizations. They're not the ones who lead formal civil society organizations in the main. They're not necessarily employed by civil society organizations in the main, but they do important work as community activists. They do important work as student activists. And this gave us the opportunity to invite people to participate as individuals. So we ended up with, at our largest group, about 200 young people who were consistently engaged over a period of time. I think our rate of drop-off was actually very low from that initial 200, probably to kind of the mid 100s. And we saw a high level of commitment from young people who never actually got to see each other or us, other than on a virtual platform, and who were engaging in their personal capacity. And so they weren't reporting to an organization in order to keep them engaged over what ended up being about a 6-month period. And so that speaks to the commitment that young people can have with these processes. I think we often undermine young people's level of commitment, especially if they're not going to be flown somewhere to a location, or they're not going to get some kind of other incentive. Just the idea that they got to work on something meaningful was enough to keep young people engaged in a process over a long period of time virtually. I think the other important thing about that was that because young people were also engaging in their personal capacities and could do this virtually, we got a very good cross-section of young people. Usually, and having worked in the youth development space now for over 10 years, we've gotten to a point where, especially when it comes to policy discussions and these high-level discussions, that there's an urban bias to the work that we do, and sometimes an elite bias in terms of educational status. Because the process was online and SAIIA agreed from the beginning to assist with data costs as the one cost that would be covered, we got young people from all backgrounds. We got young people who had never gone to tertiary education, who had not completed school, who were in rural areas, urban areas, peri-urban areas. We had such a good, diverse range of young people, even in terms of age. We had teenagers who participated in this and were part of the process from the beginning till the end. And so it gave us really an opportunity to get a good cross-section. And I think that's something that we need to model in the youth development space. We need to make sure that the young people, we don't recycle the same young people, and that we make sure that we get a cross-section of young people that really represents the length and breadth of our countries. Another important thing was the ways in which we came up with what ended up being the 11 areas that we dealt with. And I won't take you through each of the areas, but I wanted to make 2 comments about the areas. One is that we went through a process where the young people themselves, through a technologically driven but participatory driven process, came up with what the topics would be. It took us a while. It took us a few iterations, Google Forms, all sorts of things, but we made it as democratic as possible. And I think that was good. What I enjoyed about it the most was that when we think about young people's issues and the things that they want to talk about, often we narrowly think of issues around education and economic participation. a lot of young people's issues have been limited in the minds of youth workers, in the minds of policymakers, to things around that. We've probably added governance as an additional category in the last 5 or so years in the space. But really, we have limited what young people are interested in. Some of the interesting things that came from young people themselves that they insisted should be on the list was something like peace and security. We had a peace and security working group that was oversubscribed to the point that we had to divide it into 2 groups and deal with different separate areas of peace and security in order to get that body of work done, because there were so many people interested in that. We had a high level of interest in climate change. We had a high level of interest in grants and social security issues. And it reinforced the point that I make very often, that because of the demographic dividend in the continent, and because young people make up such an important part of the population, they aren't only good for jobs, work, and economic participation. Young people actually are significant actors in our population. They are caregivers, they are parents, they are people who have to look after dependents in terms of their extended families. They are leaders in their communities, they're leaders in society. And we need to start seeing young people as more than beneficiaries of programs that we have, and more as partners and leaders in the work that we do, and that they can lead society, not only other young people. An important area that came up was the participation of youth in governance. That was the only area in all the work that we did that was youth specific. All the other areas covered all of society, not just young people. And so young people in the continent are ready to lead society, not only each other or themselves. And then the last thing I wanted to highlight was, I think, a part of the process that we took very seriously was to keep the voice of the young people front and center. So young people were divided into working groups, and in those working groups, they were given a template that would guide them through a research and writing process. We were able to step back and allow the young people's voices to come through, their interests to come through, with us checking on them regularly. Once we got that information back, we were very happy with the quality of the content. It didn't take us long. I think Steve would agree that we were surprised at how quickly we were able to get through different iterations of this document, because the quality was so high that came from the young people themselves. And we took the principal stance not to impose our voice on their voice, so that when they saw the document written up and synthesized, they could still see the very words they wrote in their documents in our document. And it's important that we keep that in mind, that we're authentic about young people and their participation, and we don't impose ourselves. Young people got to lead the presentation of these ideas to the South African government officials who engaged with them. And young people ultimately went out, actually, we did a dissemination process where we allowed them to, and gave them support to disseminate the document. They actually hosted events and disseminated the document among their peers and in their communities. And we also did some training and capacity building at the end of the process. What young people asked from us in return for their thoughts and their ideas and their participation was that we provide opportunities to build their capacity and to enable the work that they do in their communities every day to be better. And I think we met on both of those mandates. And we've now built a community of young people who stayed in a WhatsApp group, who remain engaged, and I think will become continuous champions of policy engagement going forward. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Tessa. It was really, really great working with you. I think Tessa exploded some of the myths that and some of the ways that we had worked previously. For one thing, she was really insistent that the groups of the working groups of young people manage their budget, that they're empowered to do that, not that we tell them how to spend that money. It was a very organic process. Lots of lessons were learned, and as she said, the South African young people were invited twice to the National Governing Council to present what they'd done. And I know for a fact, because SAIIA happened to get a contract to help South Africa put its self-assessment report together in 2 of the thematic areas, definitely in democracy and political governance, and also to an extent in economic governance and management. We really relied quite heavily on the submission. And as Tessa said, it went beyond just what are seen as traditional youth areas. It looked at elections, it looked at housing and health and infrastructure and so forth. And so all of those issues have made their way along the stream into the South African country self-assessment report. And as I said, at the moment, South Africa is hosting the country review mission for its second report. So thank you, Tessa. I've also posted in the chat a link to the South African submission, which is online, as well as a paper that Tessa and her partner, Toby Fayoyan, helped write, or wrote, I should say, reflecting on the experiences of the South African process. And Tessa, I'm really glad that you could join us. We've had a few of these events where you haven't been able to join us, so it's really great to hear from you. As I said, unfortunately, our speakers from Zimbabwe have been struck down with COVID and were not able to participate. So I'm just going to say a few words about the Zimbabwe process and some of the challenges that we encountered there. So it was I think it's probably one of the biggest challenges that we've had in our work over the 15 or 16 years that we've been working on Aprm at SAIIA, just given the depth and the magnitude of the problems and the issues that Zimbabwe faces. You know, it's in profound crisis politically, economically, socially. We found that there were a lot of people talked about lack of electricity, lack of economic growth, lack of jobs. As you know, the estimate is that it's about 90% of people either working in the informal economy or not formally employed. You know, the woes of Zimbabwe are well noted, and I think it's also become a very polarized society, whether you are for the opposition or for the government, even in, and maybe even especially more so in the Mnangagwa era after 37 years of rule by Robert Mugabe, who was, by the way, a staunch opponent of the Aprm. He said that Zimbabwe wouldn't join because it's going to be criticized by other countries, and that he saw this as very much a kind of Western Trojan horse, where these values and issues that are important to the West are being snuck in, which I think couldn't be further from the truth. But with his departure from the political scene, Zimbabwe did accede 3 years ago. And again, this was a process where we had to work virtually. We were not able to travel to Zimbabwe because of COVID. And it took a bit longer than we had hoped, but we had an excellent background paper that was written and was then combined with work from various NGOs. We had over the course of the work probably 40 to 50 CSOs that participated with us. They weren't all involved in the writing, but over the series of workshops and events, they joined us. I think it's a very comprehensive report, and it created some uncertainty in our partner. We worked with the SAIIA Institute, which is a fairly new think tank that operates in Zimbabwe. And towards the end, they were getting quite nervous that what was said in the report was not attributed directly to them. And so they made a big effort and initiative to make sure that in all publicity about the report, that they were noted as the facilitators of the work, but not as the authors of the work. And perhaps they were expecting some backlash. We did involve the Zimbabwean government, but it was, you know, their national process hasn't really started at all. I think civil society was a little bit worried that this quite critical report would be used against them. And so we tried to not make it easy for the government to do so. Nevertheless, SAIIA was a great partner that we worked very hard with. I think we had a really nice process. We also created a short video on the process, which you can find on our YouTube channel, along with videos on Botswana and South Africa. I can also post those in the chat. And I think what the Zimbabwe process really showed us, that it is possible, even in really difficult situations, to put such a report together if there's commitment and there's energy and there's resources. And again, I'd like to thank the government of Sweden. I see that we're joined by a representative from the government of Sweden. I'm not sure if she's still with us, but they were instrumental in providing the resources for this very important work. Just to give you a little taste of what is in the Zimbabwe report, I will post the link to the full report. But there are chapters on constitutionalism, on good political governance, on the rule of law, militarization of politics and organized violence, on democracy and elections, corruption, responsive governance, transparency and accountability, shrinking civic space, gender equality and social inclusion, public goods, service delivery and citizen welfare, economic governance and the economic crisis in Zimbabwe, and corporate governance in Zimbabwe, the case of parastatals. So each of those are chapters of about between 10 and 15 pages. So it is a bulky report, and we're aware of that. And one of the suggestions that we have had from stakeholders, which we haven't been able to execute yet, is to actually publish the executive summaries of these reports as standalone documents that people can access, and then have the link to the larger report just so that they can digest them. I think if you're like me and you open a report and it's 100 pages, it's difficult to sometimes read there and then. And finally, just to say that this is important work in Zimbabwe, and civil society is facing a number of threats from funding, from harassment, and are very worried about a bill that is currently in Parliament, the PVO bill, the Private Voluntary Organizations Bill, which they see as a mechanism by government to take control of the NGO sector, to demand permits and licenses and registration, and use it in a way that inhibits what civil society is able to do. And we've seen these sorts of laws across the continent. One of the most notorious is in Ethiopia, that any organization working on democracy is not allowed to have more than 10% of its budget provided from outside the country. So I think civil society is quite worried about that, is mobilizing around this bill, and maybe the work and the comradeship forged in the Aprm process in Zimbabwe can assist in that. I can definitely say that in countries like Zambia and Namibia and Botswana, the fact that people had been through the trenches on Aprm really strengthened the bonds and the network within civil society as new challenges came up. So because my fellow has to leave us shortly, if there are any questions on the Botswana process, if you can either just raise your hand or indicate in the chat, and I'd be happy to put those questions to my fellow. Otherwise, there will be time for question and answer at the end. Okay, I don't see anything specific for my fellow at this point. So I'm going to then turn to a very old friend of mine, Susan Mwape, who is the founder and executive director of Common Cause Zambia, an organization that seeks to promote citizens' participation in various governance processes. And just to tell you how long I've known Susan, I think it was back in about 2005, 2006, where she was a young, feisty university graduate who was introduced to the Aprm for the first time at a training workshop that I was invited to do in Zambia. And we have really stayed in touch ever since. And she's become a leading light in civil society in Zambia, and really knows a lot about the process. And recently, Susan has been appointed by the Aprm Secretariat as one of their Aprm champions, and maybe she can reflect a little bit on that in her remarks, what that entails, and what's what's new and what's happening in the Aprm. But she also is very knowledgeable about the Zambian process, and that's a few years in the past now. But Zambia has recently done 2 special reviews or targeted reviews on the tourism sector, and I'm just forgetting what the other one is at the moment. It'll come to me. But let me hand over to Susan Mwape to talk about Zambia and where the Aprm as a system is going. Susan, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's always a pleasure to participate in SAIIA events, and thank you very much for always having a solid stance in helping to guide civil society in the Aprm process. So for the Zambian process, the paper that I did looked at the journey that civil society had undertaken. Zambia had a very, very complex process. We joined in 2006, which was earlier on by President Mwanawasa. He was very passionate about good governance and promoting good governance. And we could clearly see this through the efforts that he put to try and ensure that governance processes, systems, and anything that promoted good governance was well funded and supported by his government. So in 2006, when we signed up to the Aprm, a lot of things changed. We saw a lot of funding going towards those efforts. And the process in Zambia alone, between signing up in 2006, it took 8 years because our review and report was launched in 2014. So that was about 8 years. We had 4 heads of state at the time, about 6 Aprm focal persons who had come in as different ministers. And it was a lot of things that had happened. But throughout this whole process, we also were fortunate, like my fellow shared, we were also fortunate to have had SAIIA guide us and share the role of civil society and how we could engage with the process at a much earlier stage. So by the time the government was trying to set up structures, civil society was well organized to engage with the Aprm process or contributing to the establishment of the structures like the National Governing Council, the appointment of the technical research institutions during the country self-assessment, and all these other processes. So civil society felt the Aprm was quite a process that required a lot of attention and decided to set up what we called a civil society Aprm secretariat. That secretariat played the role of liaison between civil society itself and government and created an alliance below where we were able to do pretty much what my fellow was sharing in terms of how Bokongo engaged in the process when they were setting up, when they were doing their civil society submission. We had structures. Funding was always a big challenge, and I think that's a problem that many civil societies struggle with. So what we did was we always used our network to ensure that we could get more people to know about the Aprm. So those member organizations that were part of the Aprm secretariat would ensure that when they had anything going, they would include the Aprm on their agenda. So if any member organization was going maybe out of the capital city to do any capacity building work or outreach work, they would sometimes even carry a member from the secretariat to go and train other civil society organizations. This was quite effective to the extent that when we had the country review mission coming to do the review, we had built enough capacity throughout the country that they were able to, in all the places they went to, they were able to meet somebody from civil society who was able to share and talk about what the Aprm was doing and how, what the expectations were in terms of the different thematic areas. We also were supported and as civil society, and we also did a submission, a civil society submission. And the submission itself also took an approach of bringing in civil society and them sharing their views. We looked at the key areas where we had strengths, and those were the areas where we focused on. And when we did our submission was presented to the country review mission when they came, and also the country self-assessment review team and the National Governing Council. And all our issues were actually taken on board. We looked at issues of corruption. Rather, let me go by the thematic areas. We looked at democracy and political governance. We had issues of constitution. And when we began the process of the Aprm in Zambia especially, there was a lot of tension between civil society and government because we were in the process of doing a constitutional review. And the soured relationship between civil society and government was so bad that the person who was responsible for working around the constitutional issues was the same person who was the focal point for the Aprm. And it was largely the same civil society engaging with them. So those were quite some of the problematic areas that we faced, but we still forged on. We were able to create links, we were able to build capacity and ensure that people were aware of what was going on, such that we could comfortably say that our own submission was so valuable that it was taken on board. We also heard from our lead panelist. He wrote to us to tell us that they were grateful for the input from civil society. So we found that having those measures was quite helpful for the process, and we also drew a lot of strengths and lessons from countries that had already done that. We got a lot of support from SAIIA, and something that I always tell civil society organizations that are beginning with the process or trying to engage with the Aprm is to get your hands always on the civil society toolkit. SAIIA produced a toolkit that has even now been updated. It really gave us a lot of guidance, because at the time that we started to engage as civil society, there were very few organizations that were doing what we were doing. And also understanding the complexities of the Aprm, especially at the beginning, it was quite hard. So those gave us guidance, not just for civil society, but they also had things like a guide for civil society. They had a guide for the national focal points. They had guides for the governing council. So even where the governing council was not doing the right thing, as civil society were able to tell them, you're not doing the right thing, based on the fact that there was information and knowledge that we could draw from the documentation that was there. So we found those tools very, very useful. Otherwise, we also took time to, through the different networks and organizations we engaged with, such as SAIIA, ISA, the Aprm Secretariat itself, when they went out and engaged civil society, they took us along. We shared our model, we shared what we did, and we saw that a lot more civil society organizations across the continent, in countries like Tanzania, Mauritius, Botswana, Lesotho, who were all able to provide what I can call a support group to try and draw lessons from each other's experiences and processes. So that was the journey for Zambia. It was not easy. It was quite a very long road. Sustaining the momentum over an 8-year period was not easy for us, because we had 2 heads of states dying in office, and that continuously slowed the process. So the first time that our head of state died, the process had to slow down. We were not able to continue with the Aprm, and that was at the point when we were just beginning to go into the country review mission. So we had to wait until the elections and all those processes were done before we could even proceed. When we proceeded, we had another head of state pass on, and then the process really slowed down. And then with each head of state that came along, we also observed that the commitment to the Aprm sort of reduced. And we were able to see this not just through the commitment that they put in, it was also the finances that were allocated in terms of the budgets and all. So from the time that we started up to now, the budget for the Aprm has consistently been going down. It's also worth mentioning, and I think, Steve, you've already mentioned that Zambia also did a targeted review. We did a targeted review in 2019, and we were looking at mineral resources and tourism. And we're yet to launch this report. As you know, we are just coming out of an election, which we had in August. So we are hoping that now we are going to launch the reports, look at the implementation of the recommendations in those reports, but also begin to think about doing a 2nd generation review. Congratulations to South Africa that you are taking this step. We are seeing that targeted reviews are becoming very popular. Started with one topic. We are seeing more countries going to look at more than one topic. Zambia was the first country to do more than one topic for its targeted review. We are seeing now Kenya is doing 4. And I think it's really good that countries are beginning to do that. But I think there's a lot of value also in the base reviews of the Aprm, because of the comprehensive nature of how the base reviews are undertaken. So we hope that as civil society will be able to push those issues now that we have a new government, and all the governance tensions that were political tensions are coming down. We hope that the new administration that we have now will be more keen on ensuring that the APRM and governance can go forward. So I'll end here. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Steve. Thank you, SAIIA, for the great work. Congratulations. And I'd like to also congratulate the two speakers that spoke before me for sharing their very rich experiences in South Africa and Botswana.
Thank you, Susan. And Susan never says no whenever we come knocking on her door. And I think her experiences have really been able to shape the way that the civil society processes have unfolded in other countries. Okay, we're a little behind time, so I'm going to now turn to my colleague Isabel Bosman, who works on our African governance and diplomacy program as a researcher. And before joining the research team, Isabel was a 2020 Konrad Adenauer Foundation scholar at the Institute. So we're really delighted to have her on staff now. What's interesting about this bit of research is that it's the first time that anybody has really looked at the countries that have been through second reviews. So there are at the moment 3 countries that have gone through and published their reports for their second reviews: Kenya, Mozambique, and Uganda. And Isabel, along with Kaylee Clifford, did an analysis a little bit earlier in the year. I'll post the link to the paper, where they looked at what a comparison between the first and second reviews in each country, and then as well a comparison between what happened in the 3 countries and how the APRM progressed and what lessons can be learned. So Isabel, over to you.
Thank you, Steve, for that kind introduction. I have prepared some slides, so I'm going to share these with you. I hope they're visible. And I hope that I'm audible.
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you.
Cool. So as Steve mentioned, I would like to present some research findings and observations from this paper that I wrote with Kaylee Clifford. It is titled "Third Time's a Charm, Reflections on the First and Second APRM Reports of Kenya, Mozambique, and Uganda." I would encourage you to read the paper. I'm going to try my best to capture its essence in 10 minutes. But some of the more intricate details are available in the paper. Just a brief bit of background, most of which has been mentioned already. The APRM grew from the acknowledgement that the continent's slow development was largely due to poor governance. This was seen as something that only African countries in partnership with civil society and the private sector could remedy. And I think this emphasis on partnership with civil society really came through in the presentations that preceded my own, and also ties into this broader idea of finding African solutions to African problems. So as Steve mentioned earlier, 41 countries are part of the APRM, and 3 have undergone the full review process twice: Kenya, Mozambique, and Uganda. And those are the 3 countries that we consider in this paper. So the APRM was designed to enhance governance on the continent through self-assessment and then the sharing of experience between countries. We were guided by these 3 key questions when conducting this research. So firstly, what do the country review reports of these 3 countries tell us about the persistence of certain issues? Secondly, was any progress made between the first and second reviews? And thirdly, what new concerns have cropped up?
Susan, mute, please.
Of the 4 APRM thematic areas, we considered 2. We looked at democracy and political governance, and then socioeconomic development. But we also consider a number of cross-cutting issues, which are really issues that complicate improvement in both democracy and political governance and socioeconomic development. In terms of our key findings, in terms of concerns raised and improvements between reviews, read together, we find that the first and second country review reports of these countries reveal patterns of progress and regress between reviews in the areas of democracy and political governance and socioeconomic development. So all three countries did make significant improvements in the area of democracy and political governance, the rule of law and human rights, but persistent issues that have been identified, such as corruption, poverty, and gender equality, still require attention. We find that often commitment to good governance remains kind of trapped in the realm of legislation, and follow through in terms of practical implementation is often lagging behind. And all three countries remain vulnerable to regression, particularly when it comes to managing diversity and tensions along ethnic lines. Important here, just to clarify, managing diversity relates not only to race and ethnicity, but also gender and persons with disability and even refugees. There we go. In terms of common issues that are shared by all three of these countries, these are issues that are mentioned in first and second reviews. Often there are minor improvements, but overall, the three countries studied in this paper have some way to go in overcoming these challenges. They are corruption, gender inequality, and then poverty and inequality. Poverty and inequality also largely links to access to education and access to healthcare, and importantly, poverty also often has a gender aspect and is gendered and affects women disproportionately. In terms of some specific observations with these countries regarding Kenya, progress that we do note between reviews is firstly the new constitution that of 2010, very important because democracy and good governance is really guided by the existence of a democratic constitution. So the one kind of informs the other. And then also Kenya's devolved system of government and trying to bring government closer to the people. But then in terms of specific areas of concern, identified firstly is transformational leadership. And this relates to managing change in a way that ensures broad ownership and legitimacy. And in particular here, the judiciary and civil service are identified as problem areas. Firstly, both are susceptible to corruption. It is widespread in the judiciary and civil service. Accountability in the civil service is often lacking, in part because appointments of officials aren't necessarily based on merit. And then the judiciary also seems to be more lenient to certain sectors of society. Interestingly, the business sector often experiences this kind of leniency. And then in Kenya specifically, poverty is indeed very gendered and affects women disproportionately. And there is still inequalities in terms of access to education. Then in terms of Mozambique, the post-independence civil war has kind of given this country an additional set of governance challenges, but Mozambique has been called a prime example of post-conflict reconstruction. Some of its key achievements include high levels of economic growth. At one point between 1996 and 2007, it had one of the highest global economic growth rates at 8% per annum. Its government has introduced programs to reduce unemployment. Primary school enrollment has significantly improved. And then, of course, the institution of multi-party democracy and regular elections. And indeed, Mozambique has been praised for the progress it made in institutionalizing democracy and good governance. But specific areas of concern remain, and this threatens the progress that has been made. In particular, we point to the fact that sustainable peace and unity remains a complicated matter. This is largely due to competing political interests and social interests, especially in terms of key major political parties and their interests. Also, Mozambique has to overcome the challenge of inadequate human and material resources. And then climate change, although it is a global challenge and will affect all of Africa very severely, Mozambique is especially susceptible to the worst of the effects of climate change. Drug trafficking and drug use has also been identified as an area of concern. It affects the unemployed youth in particular and has very deep links to the problem of corruption in the country. So if I may just briefly discuss this, Mozambique has become a key point of transit for an international heroin smuggling network. It's been ongoing for 2 decades plus. So heroin produced in Afghanistan is smuggled to Pakistan, and from Pakistan it is brought to Mozambique, where it makes its way to Johannesburg and then into Europe. Estimates say that 40 tons of heroin pass through Mozambique every year in this way. The smuggling network is, trafficking network is overseen by local trading families, but evidence also emerged that high-level government officials are linked to this. And for every ton of heroin exported, some $2 million remain in the country. And through bribery, these line the pockets of senior officials. Interestingly, although drug trafficking exacerbates the country's corruption problem, the involvement of senior officials in the heroin trade has ensured peaceful relations between rival trading families and significantly also ensures that little heroin remains in the country. And then the last area of concern that we identify is conflict. Important here is the Cabo Delgado province. So the second country review report of Mozambique actually mentions mounting tension in the province in 2017 following the discovery of natural gas. And it states that while it is not, the country review mission was not able to determine the root causes of this conflict, it advised government at the time to act swiftly and decisively to secure the local population and sustain peace in the country. Of course, we are aware of the extent to which this has now escalated. And underlying this, there's also the issue of youth employment and ethnic tensions. Then turning to Uganda before I close, Uganda has come a long way and indeed made significant progress since independence in terms of democratic consolidation, ending the military dictatorship, instilling respect for human rights and press freedoms, and in improving access to healthcare and education. But specific areas of concern remain, and these issues threaten to reverse this progress. In particular, we identify the risk of democratic backsliding as evidenced by constitutional amendments to remove firstly term limits, presidential term limits, and then what was being discussed at the time of the second review, removing the age limit for presidential candidates. It seems that increasingly in Uganda, the line between democracy and authoritarianism is becoming blurred. And we find that competition for political power also remains largely unequal and unfair, as the arrests of opposition candidates will attest. There are also issues surrounding the balance of power, and then weak implementation of standards and codes, and managing diversity. Especially in relation to managing diversity, there are often discriminatory clauses in legislation. For example, the Land Act of Uganda denies women land ownership rights. It only makes provision for the right to access of land and occupancy of land. The Domestic Violence Act of 2010, for example, excludes unmarried persons from its provisions. And there's also legislation that penalizes sexual orientation. So the Sexual Offences Act of 2011 makes provision only for heterosexual relations and thereby overlooks an entire group of people who could also be affected by sexual violence. This act became law this year, and LGBTQI relationships have effectively been criminalized by this legislation. Then also of Uganda's 65 indigenous communities, it is also clear that the smaller indigenous communities are at a disadvantage, and many have been subjected to forced removals from ancestral lands and exclusion from governance processes. Then just to conclude, with corruption, gender inequality, and poverty being some of the recurring issues found across the reviews of these countries, we see this as evidence that while progress has been made in the democratic and political governance realm, socio-economic development requires further attention. Other issues have not been addressed in the reviews at all. For example, although climate change has been identified as one of the most urgent global challenges, it's only included in the Mozambique reviews, and we know that it will, and indeed already does, affect both Kenya and Uganda. And then LGBTQI issues have also taken a back seat, not just in Uganda, but it does not really feature in the reviews. And then one of our key recommendations would be that the Aprm process should be seen as an ongoing attempt to improve governance, approached holistically, rather than an exercise carried out once every few years. If you would like to connect with either Kaylee or myself, you can find us on Twitter at our handles. I thank you for your attendance and for your attention.
Thanks very much, Isabel. I know a lot of work to get through in a very short space of time. We are a little bit pressed for time, but I just wanted to make the point that Kenya was very, showing the value of the APRM when there was the post-election violence in 2007, 2008. The lead panelist at that stage was Dr. Graça Machel, and she was intimately involved in the mediation and the peace agreement between the rival political parties. And actually, they took a lot from the APRM and to move into the new constitution, the devolution to counties and so forth. So there is important work that definitely comes out of the APRM. Our final speaker for today, last but not least, is Jotato Semela. She's a senior governance and public policy practitioner who's worked as a senior civil servant and international development practitioner in Africa for over 20 years. She was formerly the, I can't remember the title, but the main person in the Ministry for Public Service and Administration working on the APRM until I think about a year ago in South Africa, and was really instrumental in getting the second review going and launched, and must be quite gratified that the country review mission is finally on our shores. So Jotato, over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I do have a presentation that I prepared, but I think it might just be better if I just speak to it, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Because I'm afraid if I put it up, you might all be scared at how many words on each slide. So at least now you won't see where I cheat. But I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to share these reflections on this paper that I wrote a little bit earlier this year. Before I begin, I just want to make a slight disclaimer, as Stephen has said, because I have slightly sort of stepped back from the South Africa APRM work. When I wrote this paper earlier this year, and it was published, I think, a few months ago, there may have been developments, as Stephen has said. So I just want that to be borne in mind in terms of what I'm sharing with you in my reflections. But essentially, the purpose of the paper was to really take a step back and look at this, the implications of the expanded mandate, particularly in terms of understanding, what it has meant for the APRM, not just as an instrument, but also for the entity that has the responsibility to execute its mandate. So the way that I'm going to reflect is really just a bit of a contextual, historical context, the emergence of this mandate. I think politically something that's really important when these things, because sometimes the narratives can be misleading to make it seem like, or create the impression that things just happen or people just took decisions that may or may not have been very wise. So I'll reflect on that a little bit, and then I'll talk a bit about what some of the opportunities and challenges we've seen in light of the expanded mandate for the APRM as an instrument, as well as the executing entity, the Secretariat. And then I'll reflect a bit about, the impact of COVID-19 and the potential impacts of the institutional changes within the Secretariat itself on the future. And then I will conclude with recommendations. So if one wants to look at some of the detail that is there that I will not highlight, some of the nuance that relates to how one lands at the recommendations, I think it's online. Stephen will probably share the link for the paper itself. So I think just as a starting point, it's very important to remember that initially, in terms of the normative mandate of the APRM, a starting point must be to remember that it's the normative mandate is to foster the adoption of policy standards and practices leading to political stability, high economic growth, sustainable development, and accelerated regional and continental economic integration, with codes and standards in line with the Declaration on Democracy, Political, Economic, and Corporate Governance, and the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. So the ACTEC, as some of us refer to. That's an important starting point, because that is really what the focus of much of the activity of the APRM and the Secretariat was between 2003, when it was initially adopted by the heads of states and government, the AU Assembly, up until 2015. This is really the scope within which the activities of the APRM were conducted, and the activities that exceeding members up until that time engaged with the APRM. And then we saw the emergence of the expanded mandate. And this emergence was it evolved, it was progressive. And it was progressive within a particular context. And there are just 4 contextual factors that I'll highlight here. First of all, to say that at the point at which we saw the emergence of the expanded mandate, 2015-2016, most member states' appetite to embrace and apply this novel African homegrown, pioneered governance self-assessment tool had waned. So we had a situation where, although 33 countries had acceded to the APRM as of December 2015, only 17 had conducted the first generational review, which is the base review, which is just the minimal, essentially, of engaging with the instrument. And the last one had been in 2013. We also saw a situation where there were challenges institutionally with the APRM, with the Secretariat. So for instance, there had been no permanent chief executive officer for about 7 years. There's waning political and financial support amongst development partners, and there's generally diminished confidence from citizens. I think many amongst non-state actors, if you talk to them and you wanted to know what their thoughts were around the APRM, many thought this thing is dying. It really was on life support. Some have even said it was on life support. So there was generally a loss of confidence, and there was generally a sense that this entity was not going to be able to sort of respond to the mandate, as it were. And it was a moment of crisis, if I can even use that language. Then we saw in 2016, which was a critical decision was taken, or a critical moment at the January 2016, the heads of states and government forum, and this was under, as some of you will recall, under the leadership of Kenya President Uhuru Kenyatta, who was at that stage the chairperson, I think, of the AU. They had a summit that was specifically dedicated to the revitalization of the APRM. 3 things happened in that summit that were also critical. Along with the appointment of the CEO, there was also the adoption of what became a strategy for a turnaround strategy for the actual institution, which focused on restoring it and reinvigorating it and renewing it. And then there was also this identification of 6 priority areas that have become the core of what is broadly referred to as the expanded mandate. And those areas, really what they did was they broadened the scope of the work that would be required, the focus of the APRM as a tool and its influence, politically as well as technically, as we have seen since then. I won't go into a lot of the detail of some of that. It is in the paper, but I will just highlight what those 6 areas were. First, revisiting the philosophy of the APRM. Secondly, revising the review methodology, because one of the lessons that they'd learned was that the sort of bureaucratic requirements and machinations in terms of the actual conduct of the review seemed to have been one of the factors that waned the interest of of member states. You know, it was just too hard and too complicated, and it was too expensive. And then the third priority was around ensuring compliance with the APRM principles. The fourth one is around mobilizing resources. The fifth one was the importance of integrating the APRM into the AU system. And then finally, interrogating the role of the APRM in terms of its monitoring function of the AU Agenda 2063, as well as the UN post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals, so the SDGs. So now suddenly the APRM is required to, there's an expectation that beyond it being a self-assessment instrument of governments for member states, it has these other responsibilities at the continental level, and in fact, beyond even the reach of those member states that have acceded to the instrument. And this is why this was an important moment. But there were also other decisions. So from 2016 up until 2019, there were formal decisions that were taken that expanded the mandate. I highlight the 3 most important ones, which was the one that I've just cited now. And then there was the January 2017 decision, which required the APRM to track the implementation as well as monitor and evaluate key governance areas in the continent and provide member states in the field of rating agencies, which is a critical issue because we know what the impact of the rating agencies are in terms of the debt burden of countries and the ability to borrow resources and when those ratings are pronounced. And then in 2018, the decision that was taken again at the AU Assembly level that the APRM must become an early warning tool for conflict prevention and on the continent. And this was an important decision because it was an attempt to create synergies and harmonization between the African peace and security architecture as well as the African governance architecture. So trying to align some of the other policy instruments that have a responsibility to galvanize us towards, greater levels of peace and security around priorities such as things like silencing the guns. The 2018 summit also urged non-member states to accelerate the accession to the APRM to ensure universal accession by 2023. By implication, this meant now the Continental Secretariat had a responsibility to galvanize those non-APRM member states to come on board. And then there was a 2019 decision where the Secretariat or the APRM had the responsibility to collaborate with the AGA and develop the African governance reports, which would be tabled every 2 years. Again, having implications for not just APRM member states, but all African AU member states, essentially, and the responsibility of the Secretariat to assist all these member states to generate these national governance reports every 2 years. And then finally, there's the influence of the Kalagami reforms. The Kalagami reforms, as some of you will know or recall, were actually targeting the overall transformation and the strengthening of the overall AU system. And those reforms took place within the context of the revitalization agenda. And so, of course, then there were certain recommendations that came out of those, the reforms that had implications for the APRM. So that's just to give you a sense. I hope you're all feeling a little bit overwhelmed because that is exactly, I think, what it is, that the scope, which I described in terms of the core normative intent from 2003 and what it was up until 2016, and then what it is now as we know it, given the progression of expansion and decisions that have been taken between 2015 up until now. But be that as it may, that expansion of scope created opportunities as well as challenges. Some of those opportunities I'll highlight, for instance, the fact that because of the expanded mandate, the APRM was able to sort of respond to some of the challenges it confronted that come with the voluntary nature of the instrument. So for instance, it was able to develop innovative instruments such as those that we've heard about now in Zambia, where they have targeted reviews. And as you can hear, even that instrument is experiencing some evolution in terms of how countries are applying it. So those countries that were not necessarily keen to have a full-on base review were able to now have targeted reviews. And there's different views about this particular approach where there was concern, obviously, and there is still some concern that targeted reviews can be used so that, areas that countries don't want to get to scrutinize are then not scrutinized, they're bypassed. There was also an opportunity to reposition the APRM to monitor progress, as I said, against Agenda 2063 and as well as the SDGs. And that created benefit for countries that are not members of the APRM, because then that required that there's some technical work that is happening through things like the annual methodology forum, which was initiated in 2017, as well as others platforms that the Secretariat created to look at best practices in terms of how best to align the NDPs with the SDGs as well as the Agenda 2063. We also saw the Flagship African Governance Report, which was actually produced and taken as per the decision of the 32nd Ordinary Session of the Assembly. And we saw the Flagship report being generated, and there have been others that have subsequently come out. And then I want to just highlight, I think what has been one of the greatest opportunities of the mandate was the platforms for youth that were created by the APRM and really championed by the Continental Secretariat, as well as bringing in, really taking very seriously within the institution, this idea of building a new cadre of governance experts and new leadership through who was brought on board in the Secretariat in terms of staffing, its staffing. I think the last two things that I want to just highlight in terms of opportunities and is around the influence of the APRM that was created of key processes that have significant influence on African countries and their citizens. And here I'm talking about things like, the work that has been done around the corporate governance and the SOE network that's been established. This was in response to the high levels of non-compliance with countries, within countries in terms of corporate governance guidelines and the absence of corporate governance frameworks in some countries, and then the engagements with ratings agencies that the APRM Continental Secretariat has been able to galvanize and proactively engage in. As also in the last year, in the context of COVID, the African governance response to COVID-19, there was a report that was published last year, and I think this was a very comprehensive and useful view to showcase how African countries have responded in terms of the governance measures that have been put into place and the strategies that countries have implemented to respond to COVID. And I think in a nutshell, I think the point of sort of highlighting some of these things is to say that, the interventions that were applied in the context of the expanded mandate did have some positive benefits. It enabled the APRM to expand, to extend beyond the narrow focus of reviews and the bureaucratic processes that came with the demand of the reviews. It responded to the skeptics, those whose commitment had waned because of frustrations with the process. It inspired citizens who perceived that this process had basically died. It also increased the political appetite. So we saw the membership increased from 33 in December 2015. In April 2021, we had 41 members, and 24 of those members have completed the first generation peer reviews. I may state corrected, we are now in December 2021, so there may be a few more countries that may have come on board. And I think one of the most important aspects of the expanded mandate is that it created scope to engage with the practices of African countries, not just APRM member states, but all African countries through the reporting against what's reflected in the NDPs if there are no national plans of actions. So remember now, because of the SDG, the monitoring of the SDG and monitoring against Agenda 2063s, it's not just national plans of actions that allow us to have a line of sight into what countries are actually doing and the extent to which they're responding to the governance challenges or deficits in the context, we now have the NDPs that the APRM instrument can be used against, or the APM processes can be responsive to. So I think this was a really important development, actually. And also because it allowed us to have an opportunity to begin to look at what has been a longstanding issue regarding the national reporting, the institutional arrangements that are in place, and the extent to which those institutional arrangements enable countries to respond well or to track governance. Having said that, though, there are some strategic questions that that I think need to be raised and that one flags in the paper. And these strategic questions are important in terms of the fact that, you know, the APRM has an opportunity to harness the energy that's been created by the expanded mandate projects to do certain things. The one is around sharpening its focus. The second one is in terms of retaining relevance for member states beyond the political sphere, but also insofar as expectations of citizens. And thirdly, in terms of ensuring like institutional stability at the secretariat level. I think that the opportunities to do these things, though, are sitting against the need to balance the tensions that exist between several imperatives. These tensions are highlighted in the paper, but just very briefly, the one tension is around sustaining the level of political appetite of member states to participate while remaining relevant. So in other words, you know, you can engage through NDPs, but remember we have a normative instrument which requires that national plans of actions are actually generated. Secondly, the second tension is around the importance of demonstrating concrete value addition for member states and citizens, particularly in terms of governance improvements efforts. Again, this goes back to the importance of the national plans of actions. And thirdly, ensuring high caliber expertise through a stable pool of professionals within the Continental Secretariat. So in order for the Secretariat or the APRM instrument to succeed, it requires capable individuals, it required a stable structure, especially given the technical expertise that's required as per what the mandate now looks like. And what the paper essentially argues is that in order for this to take place and for the building that has happened over the last sort of 10 years or the last, what we had 15 years, a few years ago celebrating the APRM, there's certain things that have to happen. First of all, there must be a rationalization of actions and the focus on actions that will have direct influence or positive impact on member states' ability to actualize the recommendations or reviews. So for this to happen, and in terms of consolidation, there's a set of recommendations, very broad recommendations that the paper sort of lands at. And there's some arguments that are made, and with a bit of detail, quite frankly, in terms of analyzing what has happened with national plans of actions, analyzing some of the finessing that has had to happen in terms of how the Secretariat has had to succeed in terms of keeping member states on board and walking the journey with them, even when the issues have been difficult. Those four recommendations, the four recommendations broadly, the first is that there must be a systematic programmatic evaluation that's conducted to establish the challenges countries experience in moving from the first to the second generation report. The second one, I'm not going to elaborate on any of this because I'm conscious of time. I've taken quite a bit of time already. The second one is that there must be rationalizations of actions to focus on those, I think I've said this before, that will have a direct influence on the positive impacts on countries' abilities to actualize the recommendations of country reviews. So the country reviews must remain a pillar of the actual process itself. We can't do away with those, and how those country reviews are done and the integrity with which those country reviews are done and how they're responded to must remain a central focus and priority. Thirdly, this is about civil societies. Civil society actors must continue to galvanize and provide critique and analysis of the value of the expanded mandate, interventions for their respective countries. So civil society must continue to ask the hard questions, so that you don't get distracted by the excitement of the fact that countries are participating. We need to be sure that there's value that's being derived and that the hard questions are being asked. And then the fourth recommendation has to do with what we've learned from COVID and what is possible. So the Secretariat has to build on the experience and pursue a hybrid model of engagement. We learned that it was possible to actually conduct country reviews through hybrid formats that have virtual, that use virtual spaces. And this is an important lesson because we know also the cost from a sustainability perspective, the cost of conducting missions, the cost that comes from the operationalization of these activities from the Continental Secretariat level. We now have seen that it's possible to do it at lower cost. In fact, the Secretariat has guidelines. They actually drafted guidelines on how to conduct country reviews in virtual ways. And then the last recommendation, my last comment, is that we have to ensure that the necessary transitional arrangements and capabilities continue to be built on. In terms of the complement of the professional staff at the Secretariat. I flagged this in the paper because, now that the Aprm is an entity within the AU system, all of the staff in the Continental Secretariat have to adhere to the regulations of the AU, and one of those has to do with terms of office. So we know that there's a transition that is likely coming with the CEO. If it hasn't already started, I don't know. But the point is to say that there must be continuity and stability because those, especially at the senior level, there's been such a long history of institutional memory built and capability and relationships that are necessary for the work to be able to go well. And so there must be some plan, I hope, so that there is continuity because of the experience that we had in the first 7 years of the life of the institution. My dear brother Stephen, I thank you very much as chair for the privilege to present, and I want to say thank you to all of you for listening, and hand over back to you. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Jotato. It's a really rich paper. Please make sure that you go and consult it. I'd like to just thank everybody who participated today, my team, especially Isabel and Kaylee for setting this up. Sarasa and Ndumi on the controls, Nikki and Spiwe on social media. We don't have any questions in the question box and we are a little bit over, so I'm going to conclude it here. Just wishing you all a safe and healthy December, and we'll be ready to rumble back in January next year. So keep well, everybody, and thank you for coming.